Hello, I'm Dr. Tanya Wyatt, Professor of Criminology at Northumbria University. This is video 3 of my series on the implementation of and compliance with CITES for my AHRC Leadership Fellowship. Thank you for taking the time to watch this findings video of the first case study conducted for this bit of research. Over the course of this short video, I'm going to share with you why Canada is featured as one of the case studies. I'll then give some background information about the legislation and state of knowledge about CITES in Canada and the context of the wildlife trade there. And then I'm going to share with you what my interviewees had to say about CITES implementation and compliance in Canada. As I mentioned, the Delphi Iterative Survey participants pointed to numerous countries as possible examples of good practice. The US, the UK, and the EU were frequently mentioned as models that seemed to be working, but these have been written about, and I wanted to highlight unknown approaches and actors that may have new knowledge that can inform improvement. Thus, Canada was mentioned and chosen as a member country that has best practice and lessons to share. Canada has relatively few CITES species to oversee in terms of exports. There are 13 CITES animal species living in Canada, 7 mammals, mostly cetaceans, 5 birds, 1 reptile, the leatherback turtle. There are 9 plant species. Like for a majority of countries, most of these are orchids, 6 of them, 1 cactus, the eastern prickly pear, and also American ginseng and golden seal. Most CITES trade involving Canada involves imports. The graph is a rough overview of the imports that have been recorded between 2014 and 2018. You can see from the different color-coded bar graphs that a majority of imports are plants. That would be followed not so closely actually, by reptiles, mammals, and then each of these are decreasing. So it's really those 3 areas, those 3 categories of species that Canada is dealing with in terms of imports. Canada is a Category 1 country, which means there are the properly designated authorities, violations of CITES are prohibited, there are penalties and confiscations are possible. CITES is implemented through the Wild Animal and Plant Protection and Regulation of International and Interprovincial Trade Act, which gets reduced to the acronym of WACRITA. It is an environmental law specifically to implement CITES. This is similar to the more well-known Lacey Act in the United States. So acquiring of wildlife must be legal by the regulations from which the wildlife was taken. That means that it's a fairly powerful form of legislation that it depends on where that wildlife is actually sourced from or coming from, not necessarily the legislation where it is being taken into. In Canada, it's prohibited to import or domestically trade anything illegally obtained elsewhere. As I said, very similar to the Lacey Act, but this is even within Canadian provinces. It's also prohibited to knowingly possess illegal wildlife. The Management Authority, Scientific Authority, and Environment Authority are divisions of the same service. There are interprovincial permits as well as international CITES permits. And the penalties in Canada range from 5,000 Canadian dollars up to 12 million Canadian dollars. And also there is the possibility of imprisonment from 6 months to 5 years. In regards to penalties, corporations are at the higher end of those penalties. Fines take into account undue financial hardship. If a corporation that has shareholders has been convicted of an offense under this act, the court shall make an order directing the corporation to notify its shareholders in the manner and within the time directed by the court. The shareholders have to be informed of the facts relating to the commission of the offense and the details of the punishment imposed. That's a very interesting aspect and very well detailed about corporate crime. The enforcement authority does have peace officer powers, meaning that they have the authority to investigate, arrest, and so forth. So there is no need for them to actually call in another police agency. In terms of confiscation, there's no specific mention of live wildlife, but presumably the law covers all forms because it just speaks of wildlife in general. They can be seized and forfeited on conviction, or they can be returned upon acquittal or at the end of the case. A portion of the fine under the penalties may go to an environmental damage fund. The court may also order various conservation, research, and education activities be supported, as well as a 3-year follow-up with any convicted offender. What was mentioned by the interviewees and within the answers of the Delphi Iterative Survey is that there's a low priority of wildlife for the border agencies, and that certainly is not unique to Canada, but has been repeated several times. This is a challenge of overcoming the lack of priority by customs and border agencies in regards to wildlife. As an aside, this may be a strength of the US and UK, where there are border officers integrated into the CITES enforcement teams. Several interviewees also pointed to Canada's cumbersome national legislation in terms of reflecting the updates of listings of the Conference of Parties. So the form of Canada's legislation does not allow immediate listing of newly added species to the appendices after the Conference of Parties. This points to a lesson to be learned that national legislation needs to be quickly adaptable to reflect these kinds of listings so that the species in the wildlife can get protection as soon as possible, and also that Canada or other countries with similar systems don't have to continually put reservations in. One of my respondents talked about the reason why this is being that Canada requires public consultations and cabinet approval to add each new listed species. So every 3 years you have these reservations being taken after the COP, and that's something to consider and something to improve on. Apart from those lessons, though, Canada appears to have several elements of practice that might help other members to improve. The 3 authorities have separate defined missions and tasks to deliver for implementation of, compliance with, and enforcement of CITES. Maybe most importantly is that these 3 are focused only on wildlife, and this is not part of a larger portfolio of work for the staff that are undertaking these. An interesting aspect of the working relationship that one interviewee thought helped them to do a good job was that they're physically located in the same building, which means it was easier, possibly, to foster a collegiate, close relationship. It likely helps in CITES implementation for Canada that the US has the same basic legislation and systems, since the US is one of, if not the most prolific importer and exporter of wildlife. Their working relationship is sound. Several survey participants mentioned that having good domestic regulation was key to good overall CITES implementation in Canada, which I mentioned in video 2. There is evidence of this in Canada, this best practice kind of policy in terms of domestic national legislation, where CITES species are also monitored between provinces. Canada is active internationally and has an enthusiastic, passionate team of staff. After controversial listing proposals in the 1990s about the polar bear, Canada included Indigenous members on co-management boards that include members of the federal government, the Indigenous communities, and the provincial governments. These focus on how they can protect species that are destined for commercial export in Canada. Now there's also significant discussions about reconciliation to Indigenous people that several of the interviewees point out. Export of commercial species like polar has a 3-pronged approach around traceability. So when the bear is killed, the person who has killed the wildlife contacts the conservation officer in their local area. The conservation officer then microchips the various parts of the bear that are going to be traded and takes DNA samples and stable isotope samples to pass along to the scientists, who then ensure a traceability from kill to sale. Finally, in order to work around the limited funding that is given to CITES, Canada engages in multilateral agreements and operations. For instance, the month-long Operation Thunderball involved 109 countries and resulted in the seizures of tens of thousands of protected plants and animals worldwide. According to Environment and Climate Change Canada, their enforcement officers responded to over 100 complaints during this time and tips from the public concerning habitat and wildlife destruction. Enforcement officers also conducted dozens of inspections, enforcement activities, and hunter checks, and led a series of border-crossing blitzes to look for evidence of illegal exports of Canadian species, as well as illegal imports of exotic species. Canada then has several things to learn from: the importance of a legislative scheme that updates to reflect listings quickly, the value of specialization of wildlife CITES authorities, the importance of good working relationships between the authorities and the local and Indigenous communities, and with other countries as well, and the benefit of actively getting involved in global activities, be that CITES, Interpol, or operations. Thank you. The next video will be about the second case study, Indonesia.